Right now, when with no more further delays, I'm going to introduce João Abreu. So João Abreu lives in Aveiro. His favorite dish is cheesecake. Um, and the name of these two cats is Bolacha and Lira. You know, he loves cooking, he loves gaming. Every time I do a call with him in an interview or in a meeting, his background is full of board game boxes, like just getting out of control. So I don't know what's going to be set up, but every time I do a call or an interview with him, there is like tons of board games. So let's see what happens. He says that he never created a big incident, but his talk is not even started yet. So let's wait and see. He's going to talk about self-hosting static blog. So maybe he's also a writer. I don't know. Let's find out just right after this.
Hey guys, I hope you've been enjoying the tech day so far. Today I'll be talking about self-hosting a static blog and actually getting shit done. But before we get into that, and before we actually start talking about that, a bit about myself first. First off, hey, my name is João. I'm a front-end developer at Mindera. I've been working here for like 2 years almost. I've been working in the field for a bit more. And I'm sort of a creative writing noob. Which means that I'm not actually good at doing it, but it's something I enjoy doing in my free times. And I've been hosting a couple of blogs throughout the years. I've had a WordPress blog, I've had a Ghost blog that I self-hosted for a while. And it's kind of the context of this entire talk, because in the last month, I've picked up a project that I have shelved for a long time now. And it's kind of the bane of every developer to have a number of projects that they've shelved and they haven't picked up, either due to time constraints or either due to just lack of motivation. And honestly, there's no better motivation than being stuck at home with nothing to do. So that's kind of what I went ahead and done. So I've started to develop a static blog, because honestly, a blog is not much more than static CSS and HTML, and there's no real point in having it being dynamically rendered every time you hit your server. So I'm going to run you through this, and obviously I've done this for a blog, but it's applicable for websites, it's applicable for stores, although you probably have to change the CMS. But let's get to it. So the adventure itself is split on a number of steps. So the first thing you need to do is actually get a server. Then you need to get a domain. Then you need to set up Nginx as a reverse proxy server and also as a static assets server. You also need to set up a CMS. I'm going to be using Ghost for this. You need to set up a static site project. We're going to be using Gatsby for this. And at the end of all of it, we probably need to sort of automate everything, and we're going to be using Jenkins to glue it all together. So about the server, a bit as opposed to most conversations nowadays, I'm kind of ignoring the entire AWS, Google Cloud, and Azure stuff, because honestly, my page has like at the most 10 page views a day in good days. So I imagine if you have a personal website, it's kind of the same thing. So you don't really need that scalability. You don't really need to worry about that. So a good alternative is to actually have a VPS, which is a virtual private server, and it's kind of a small machine that you can manage at will. And there are a number of stuff number of places actually that you can get it from, and too many providers you can choose. I've listed a couple of them that I've been using throughout the years, but honestly, choose whatever. If you've used one that's not here, just continue using them. Otherwise, I'm going to be talking a bit about DigitalOcean, and it's going to be the kind of the topic of this talk. So if you go into DigitalOcean, you create an account and you want to create a VPS, they call it a droplet, and you have kind of a wizard. Again, most of the default options are fine. It's going to ask you what distribution you want. Choose whatever you feel comfortable using. I would use Ubuntu if you're not really familiar with it, because although to be honest, most of the software we're using is kind of doesn't really care about that. So just choose whatever. It's also going to ask you about which size of the machine you're going to want. And if you're just messing around, just pick the lowest one. It's also the cheapest one, so it's probably the best option. It's also going to ask you what data center you want to use. And again, you need to look at where your clients are at and you need to choose something that's close to them. So if you're in Portugal, you probably want something in London or Germany. In this case, there's no real place that is very much closer than that. And you also want to set up your SSH keys. Now, if you don't know what an SSH key is, it's probably a good time to put your Google skills to test and go look for it, because this talk is big enough without me going into that. But yeah, you do that and you complete the entire thing, and hopefully at the end of it, you'll have a dashboard with your VPS. So you have a number of things here. You have a dashboard with a couple of information about your server, CPU usage, load average, and lots of stuff related to that. But honestly, the only thing you care right now is getting the IP. So why is this? Because you need to access your servers so you can actually do stuff. So you don't need to mess around with this dashboard anymore. And before we get into that, we can talk a bit about the domain, or honestly, maybe skip it. I'm assuming that most people that are watching this have dealt with the process of actually buying a domain somewhere along the line. And if you have, just use whatever you want. If you haven't and you're not familiar with it, try Namecheap. If you want like a domain that is in .pt, you probably have to deal with DNS.pt. And yeah, it's simple enough, and you'll probably be able to do it by yourself. Otherwise, something I would recommend to do is, if you haven't before, try Cloudflare. Their free tier is pretty bloody awesome, and it provides offline navigation, it provides caching, it provides threat prevention. It also gives you kind of SSL, at least from the client to the Cloudflare servers, which we'll be using for now. And yeah, that's about it. Giving you an example of what I've set up in Cloudflare for this specific project. I've omitted most of it that wasn't really related to this project, but I've set up 3 subdomains, one for the CMS, one for Jenkins, one for www because you actually need that. And I've also set up the actual server, which you're going to be pointing at. In this case, it's going to be launch.sh. If you actually go there, you can actually check the website itself. And you're going to want for them to all point to the same IP, either IPv4 or IPv6. You can do this as you go along, but I find it easier to just set this up at the beginning. And after you've done it, you have a server, you have a domain, and you have a number of things you have to do on your server once you SSH to it. So you need to configure users, you need to configure sudoers, you need to configure SSH, SSHD, you need to configure your firewall. And honestly, DigitalOcean has a couple of guides that you can follow and are pretty cool for this. So you can follow them. And while you're at it, might as well just install Nginx following their guides, and install both Java and Jenkins, because Java is a dependency of Jenkins. And yeah, just go ahead and do it. And hopefully at the end of it, you'll have something that is very similar to something like this, which means that everything you've done so far is working. So if you go to your page and Nginx is serving a static HTML, everything is fine. If you haven't, you've botched something along the line and you need to go back. But otherwise, everything is cool. If you do have Nginx running, something you can do right now, or you can do as you go along as well, is set up the actual routes for Nginx. Now, for the blog, you just want Nginx pointing to a folder and serving everything that's inside this folder. By the way, I'm pointing directly to sites enabled. When you're dealing with Nginx, it's kind of common for you to do a create to file and sites available, and then symlink it to sites enabled. Just go ahead and do it in sites enabled. Doesn't really matter for now. We're just doing a small thing. So for the blog itself, you want to serve the entire folder, and you're going to understand how this works a bit later. But for both Jenkins and Ghost, they're a bit different, because you want to use Nginx as a reverse proxy. So instead of a proxy where you make a request to a server and it proxies it elsewhere, Nginx is receiving a proxy from a client and proxying it to an internal service that is bound to a certain port. Jenkins is bound to 8080 by default, and Ghost is bound to 2368. The only thing that matters here is really the proxy path. Everything else is kind of fluff. You might include it, you might not include it. Obviously, Nginx configurations go way beyond this, but this is as simple as you can get, and it can get everything working, which is cool. Anyway, you go into this, and something you might as well do right now is create your deployment folder. So you can just go in var.w and blog, and you can create that folder. You can also, while you're at it, you can give permissions to Jenkins to own that folder, because Jenkins is going to take care of the deployment. But yeah, so Nginx, domain, and server, and everything is working. So we can move on to the CMS. And this is actually the source of your entire data. Ghost, for those who don't know, is kind of a blogging platform. It works both self-hosted and hosted by them. The platform itself is very similar to WordPress, with the exception it's kind of simpler, more lightweight. And it's honestly something, the biggest difference is honestly that it's built on JavaScript. So if something went wrong, and especially due to my background, I could just go into the source code and fix it. And that's a big thing for me, because I did run into a couple of problems with Ghost. But yeah, let's go into it. Obviously, one big dependency of Ghost is Node. You can either set it up like this through a PPA in Ubuntu, and you can check and install it. You can use NVM to install Node, whatever you want. It's fine. Although it needs to be above Node 10 because of compatibility reasons. Gatsby is also compatible with Node 10, so pretty cool. And after you do that, you can go ahead and install Ghost. Now, Ghost has a couple of ways it can be installed, but I would recommend for you to make use of Ghost CLI so you can install your CMS, essentially. And once you do that, you need to install it as a global package through NPM. And Ghost has this is essentially ripped off from Ghost's guide. But you want to create a folder for Ghost, you need to set up permissions if you have created a user for Ghost. I haven't. And then you need to run the installation. Now, I did skip a big step here, and I'm kind of omitting it on purpose, which is database configuration. Honestly, you're just using this as a headless CMS. And by the way, headless in this sense would be for it not to have a front end. Ghost is kind of a fake headless CMS because it's serving a front end, but we'll get there. But related to the database itself, the only time Ghost is going to see requests is either when you go there and change stuff or when you build your static site. It's not being served to the client, so load isn't really an issue, so you can just deal with SQLite and it works wonders. After you run the installation process, it will run you through a wizard. It's going to ask you for the URL. It's going to ask you if you want to set up Nginx, which you don't because you already have. And it's going to ask you if you want to configure systemd and if you want to start Ghost, both of which you want to say yes. Hopefully, at the end of this, you'll have something like this. Now, it's weird because, yeah, this is a dynamic blog and it's not exactly what we want, but it's halfway there. So you can go into the admin configurations of Ghost, and if you've ever been in WordPress or another CMS, it's essentially the same thing. And by the way, yeah, if you want to use WordPress for this, if you want to use Netlify, if you want to use any other CMS, it's totally fine. But if you're using Ghost, something you want to do is go into the configurations and make the site private. And this is kind of their version of making it headless. Besides having a REST API and a GraphQL API, they allow you to block the front end of the website through a password. It's weird. It's still serving the front end just behind a password, but it's fine. Let's roll with it. And you also want to set up two integrations, one for Gatsby and one for Jenkins. Both of them should be empty by now. We're going to get to Jenkins later on, but essentially the integration for Gatsby is just create it and forget it. What you do have to point out and stick it in a notepad or something is the content API key, because you're going to need this for Gatsby. And let's talk about Gatsby. Gatsby is a static site generator. So if you've ever seen Jekyll, if you've ever seen Hugo, it's essentially the same thing, with the exception that instead of Ruby and instead of Go, you're dealing with JavaScript and React. So building templates in Gatsby is kind of easier. And if you have a background in front end, and if you ever mess with React, you'll have an easier time messing around with Gatsby. And that's kind of the motivation that we're following here. Again, if you don't want to use Gatsby and want to use Jekyll, that's fine as well. Most of the things I'm talking about, you can just pluck them out and they'll work just as well. For Gatsby, you'll need to, again, install Gatsby CLI. as a global package. And something you can use, and it's going to save you a lot of time, is a Ghost starter. So they have kind of a boilerplate that you can use that already has the bindings for GraphQL. And the moment you build your project, it essentially sets up a blog like the one in that Ghost provides, except that it's completely static. Something you want to do on the side is also set up your remote repository. And I've done it on GitHub. You can do it in GitLab. You can do it in Bitbucket. Doesn't really matter. But you're going to have a repo just because Jenkins is going to need it, and you want to do this as hands-off as possible. So create your blog or create your website, whatever, push it to remote, and go forward with it. So you'll have something like this, and this is something you're probably very familiar with. So this is a view from a project in GitHub. What you're going to have to configure for stuff to appear in your screen that's coming out of your CMS is a file called .ghostjson, and this contains the configurations for the API URL and the content API key. Since we don't have two environments, just stick the same configurations in both, the ones that you got from Ghost, and we can go forth with that. But we don't really have a lot of time to talk about configuring Gatsby, but I'm still going to give you kind of a glimpse onto what it's doing in the background. So the Ghost starter of Gatsby Ghost is essentially this. And this has a number of things. This is kind of the mastermind. This is the Gatsby Node.js, and this is kind of the mastermind of the entire Gatsby orchestration. So it exports a method called create pages, and then it queries Ghost with all this stuff, which is all the information it has and all the information it needs. All these GraphQL queries are defined elsewhere, but essentially it gets all the information from Ghost and it goes through them, and it creates individual pages for each post that you might have or each page that you might have, along with categories, tags, and all of that stuff. Something else that I can show you is kind of a component on Gatsby. This is the index component. If you've ever messed around with a React component, it's essentially the same thing, and this is going to look very familiar to you. So this is a functional component. So index is exporting a layout that is then iterating through a number of posts, and for each post this is going to generate a static HTML then with your page index, essentially blog index, I mean. At the end of the file, though, you're going to see something like a GraphQL query, and this is what's going to fetch information from Ghost, and it's going to pass it along to your functional component as data. Yeah, it's relatively simple, especially if you use the starter. It's going to make your life a lot easier. We could maybe talk a bit more about this in another talk, but for now, let's move on. You want to build it, and after you build, after you run an npm run build, and after you push things to your deployment folder in the server, you should have something like this, which is very familiar to the one that Ghost was serving, with the exception this is completely static. So at this point, you kind of have everything you need to run a blog, with the exception that if you change something in Ghost, you need to manually deploy it, build and deploy, I mean. And if you change something in your template, you need to manually deploy it as well. So it's kind of a pain in the ass. And what's going to ease it a bit is using a CI/CD automation tool. In this case, it's Jenkins. If you're familiar with Circle CI, if you're familiar with Travis CI, if you're familiar with GitLab pipelines, it's all the same. Just use whatever you're familiar with. I've had previous experience with Jenkins, and it's kind of the reason why I'm using it. It's also fairly easy to configure, so let's just go along with it. If you did install Jenkins previously, you're going to, if you go to your subdomain, which is jenkins.lounge.sh, you're going to run into something like this, which is the configuration process of Jenkins. You need to read a file, then you need to create a user, then it's going to ask you what plugins you want to install and what plugins you don't, and go along with the defaults. It's fine. Don't worry about it. The only thing you need to do extra is go into the configurations of Jenkins and add a new plugin, which is called generic webhook trigger, and this is going to make the whole thing make sense and glue the entire thing together. After that, Jenkins is also going to prompt you to create a new project, which obviously you want to do. Set it up as a pipeline and Configuration-wise, this pipeline is relatively simple. You don't want any concurrent builds. You want to enable the generic webhook trigger. Eventually, set up a token. Doesn't really matter what token it is. Just remember the URL and the token so you can actually do something in the next slide. And if you continue to the end of the configuration of the pipeline, you're going to run into a pipeline script, which is the meat of the entire thing. So I'm not a QA person. I'm not an infrastructure person. I've set up a really, really crude pipeline, which obviously could be very improved. But for this, it works. You just have a couple of stages where you want to clone your repository, you want to install the dependencies of your project, you want to run the Gatsby build process. And once you've done that, you want to clean the deployment folder because you might have previous deployments that you don't want messing around with you. And essentially, then you just have to copy the files to the deployment folder. And hopefully, if you've done that, you've saved and you've run the build, everything should be green. Realistically, that won't happen. You will probably fail somewhere along the line. This was my fourth build because I had something misconfigured, and it's normal. Just go through it, debug it, and fix it, and everything will be fine. In the end, obviously you can manually run the Jenkins build to deploy, but you still want it to be a bit more automated than that. So let's glue it all together. So going back to Ghost, we created an integration for Jenkins, and we need to add an event for publish update, and delete. And we need to make it so that it's going to trigger the webhook that we added in Jenkins. What this means is we wanted to, every time we essentially add a new post or update a post or delete a post, Ghost is going to make a request to Jenkins, which is going to trigger a build and then a deployment. So this will make our lives a lot easier if you just want to be like an editor of a blog or a website. You also want to go into the place where you hosted your repo, and you want to do the same thing. You want to set up a webhook so that whenever you change your template or your project, you're going to make a request to Jenkins so it runs a build. So that's a lot of things. And when we're here, we're mostly done. So kind of summarizing what we have a machine, VPS, that's running Nginx, that is kind of like the gateway to Ghost, Jenkins, and it's also serving a folder with static assets. Ghost is triggering Jenkins whenever there's an update on the content you had there. GitHub is also triggering Jenkins whenever there's any change to your repo. Jenkins, whenever he wants to build, is going to get information from the repo you've defined, and it's going to build Gatsby, and then it's going to deploy the files to the static folder you've defined. And that's about it. Honestly, if you really want to, you can do this in like 1 hour, not more than that. Just doing this presentation, I didn't take much longer than that. So you can definitely do this in 1 hour and have time to spare, which is really cool. Obviously, at the end of the day, there's still a lot of things to improve. I mean, I didn't even go into how you could customize your template, which is obviously kind of why I wanted to have a Gatsby blog, so I could be able to actually change it. I didn't talk about monitoring. You have the VPS provider tools, but for the most part, they're not enough. You need a bit more. You also have analytics, especially if you're running a very user-centric website. You probably want to know what pages are the most seen by your users. You talked about SSL and HTTPS, but only from client to the Cloudflare servers. If you want full encryption from the client to your server, you're going to have to go to Let's Encrypt and get some certificates and set them in Nginx. And also Dockerization. I mean, this is kind of really crude solution to delivering a product. To be honest, it's kind of using technology as a means to an end. Obviously, if you could set everything inside a container, you could have separation concerns. You could have a lot. You could have your security improved by a lot. So there are still stuff to do. I've shared this code in GitHub, so you can go into my mock blog. I've also set the scripts both for Nginx and the pipeline for Jenkins there. You can actually access the website and launch SH. And if you do and are curious about this and you want to set up your own personal website, feel free to throw me an email if you run into any problems. I'll try to answer it as soon as I can. Um, Going a bit into a Q&A, it seems we have a couple of questions. Gatsby, Next.js, or Jekyll? Honestly, just choose whatever. I'm actually not aware. Next.js is does kind of a different thing, while Gatsby and Jekyll are actually generating the static pages. Next is doing so usually on a. It can do that, but it can also be. You can stick it in a Lambda, and it's going to run on the server, and it's going to return the rendered page. Just use whatever you feel more comfortable with. If you're okay with Ruby, go with Jekyll. If you're okay with Gatsby, with JavaScript, choose either Gatsby or Next.js. I honestly don't really have a strong opinion one way or the other. Um, why do I need a www record? Well, I don't, and that's a good point. I might actually amend this. It's kind of a legacy thing. I've copied most of the stuff from my old Cloudflare accounts. But yeah, that's a good point. But apparently we don't really have any more questions, so that's about it, guys. Again, if you do have any more things you want to ask me, feel free to shoot me an email.